actual cruiser. And Lusitania was going to have a superior armament to that. So by September 17th, she entered the fleet register as an armed auxiliary cruiser. That's Admiralty books, British Admiralty, as well as German Admiralty, okay? So everybody knew what this boat was up to, okay? This is a very important point. Meantime, guess what? Things aren't going well over on the Western Front. Epic charges into machine gun fire through barbed wire, not working, not breaking the stalemate of trench warfare. So what do they decide to do? Blow each other to kingdom come with increasing calibers of artillery. So this led to a munitions or a shell crisis of 1915. We don't have enough stuff to blow everybody to kingdom come, right? So this was a real problem. This was seen as the decisive weapon. You hear this a lot in World War I, the decisive weapon that would break the stalemate. So this led to a big political crisis in the UK. Been a serious problem since the outbreak of the war. How do we get more weapons? How do we get more ammunition? Yeah, driven by the notion artillery alone could control the battlefield. So Munitions Act of 1915 was an act passed by Parliament on July 2nd, designed to maximize munition output and brought private companies supplying this under the tight control of newly created Ministry of Munitions under David Lloyd George. So basically, this was saying that the war was so pressing that you had to drop everything and make shells and guns. And we don't care where we get them, from the United States, from wherever else, from Canada, we just need them. So this was giving them a green light to, and also basically was putting a hold on any kind of labor strikes, right? That was out of the question. That was put on hold till after the war was won. So this was all hands turned to make guns, to make shells, and get as many materials for that over from our old friend, the United States, as we can, okay? So it's this wonderful German proclamation, 1915, early February, basically saying what they're gonna do. Waters surrounding Great Britain and Ireland, the Holdington Channel hereby declared to be a war zone. So guess what? If you enter this war zone, you're going to be torpedoed, basically. And you can read it. Even neutral ships exposed to danger in the war zones, blah, blah, blah. Misuse of neutral flags. This was done all the time on merchant vessels. Sure, they see a sub. They're flying the Union Jack. Well, guess what? We're going to hoist an American flag. And they certainly won't torpedo us now because we're neutral now. This was done all the time. Furthermore, at sea, many sub-commanders noted that, say, on a foggy day or even in stormy conditions, one flag looks much like another. So it's really hard to tell the nationality of some vessels. As the war wore on, they didn't care. They just torpedoed whatever ship that they were looking at. So basically, this is just, yeah, Chief of the Admiral Navy, Berlin, basically saying that everything around England is a war zone and it's fair game for U-boat attacks, all right? So if that weren't enough, just before Lusitania sailed, this was published in the New York Times. You can read it. Travelers intending to embark on an Atlantic voyage, state of war just between Germany and our allies, FYI, right? The zone of war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles, folks. So yeah, basically if you do this, if you're going to get on one of these liners, you're doing it at your own risk, and we're not going to be held responsible for what happens. That's Imperial German Embassy in Washington, D.C. So this was fair warning, okay? They thought so anyway. Many people thought they wouldn't dare, and this is what lured a lot of people on board these vessels. They wouldn't dare. Moreover, Lusitania and Mauritania way too fast for a subboat, as a U-boat, as I mentioned, right? So this is taken from the actual manifest, and the actual manifest for Lusitania was found in FDR's safe. It was a state secret for many years, but this basically gives you kind of a rundown of some of the stuff. Ammunition cases, you can see the quantities, right? Copper cartridges, leather, sheet brass, copper. These were all considered contraband because all of these were used to make munitions. And this is just some of it. There were other things. For example, there was a huge shipment of cheese and butter that were put in an unrefrigerated cargo compartment. Now, cheese and butter, so-called, but many suspected it was more ammunition, more shells. Shrapnel, empty shell casings were also packed and loaded. There's just a lot of munitions going into Lusitania, okay? So in England, yeah, there's a lot of speculation, discussion, theorizing about whether or not England wanted or helped Lusitania be sunk. Winston Churchill, who was First Lord of the Admiralty at this time, sent to Walter Runciman, President of the Board of Trade. Churchill wrote the following: "It is most important." I should do it in a Churchillian voice, but that's too corny. "It is most important. No, it's most important to attract neutral shipping to our shores in the hope, especially of embroiling the United States with Germany. For our part, we want the traffic. The more, the better. And if some of it gets into trouble, better still." Okay. So what's he saying? If a big liner gets torpedoed, great. It'll draw America into the war all the quicker. So radio exchanges between Lucy and the Admiralty from May 5th, 7th still remain classified today. Okay, so there's a lot of speculation whether, actually Captain Turner said quite explicitly that he was never warned by the Admiralty that U-20 was in his area, just that subs were seen off the South Irish coast. Okay, so anyway, this is part of the, I won't call it a cover-up, but this is part of things that some people deem are unfit for public consumption. Okay, so good old Captain Turner, Lusitania's previous captain, Dow, yeah, he quit because he just found carrying contraband and passengers in the same ship just too distasteful to continue to do it. Captain William Turner didn't have a problem with it. You know, it's a tough one. Again, Turner was thinking, well, we're fast enough, it won't be a problem. We're helping the war effort. You see, it just depends on your viewpoint, how you view this event, how you rationalize your actions, right? So anyway, Captain Turner takes command of Lusitania on well before the fateful voyage. But meantime, as alluded to by Captain Dow, this mixed use of munitions and passengers have been going on since the outbreak of the war. So the final voyage, May 1st through 7th, okay, and there's Lusitania in the image leaving Port of New York. I was hoping I could play this. I don't know if it'll work. This is, oh, here we go. Yeah, it'll work. You guys seeing that? I hope so. This is the film clip, the last film clip of Lusitania leaving Port of New York. I'm so excited that it's actually working. I'm not going to waste time with all the people showing up in their cars. There they are, getting their luggage. Everybody's moving fast because motion pictures were in their infancy. Come on, let's get to the good part. Here we go. Yeah, there's one guy. By the way, Vanderbilt was on this, Alfred Vanderbilt was on this voyage and he perished too. You know, sort of the doppelganger to J.J. Astor on the Titanic. Here we go. Here's Lusitania. There she is. Everybody waving. Everybody's having a good time. This is the aft docking bridge up here. Okay, this is what you would use to bring her into the port. Good unobstructed view of the ship looking forward. Anyway, it's just one of these poignant things. This is the last footage before she sunk. Yeah, signal to start. Hurry up there, buddy. Show's waiting on you. There he goes. Anyway, let's skip ahead a little bit. Ship starting moving slowly aft, probably under tugs are helping her out now. There's all the lifeboats. Most of the lifeboats on Lusitania were not able to be launched, and we'll get to that in a little bit. It's very, very, very sad. And I think that's Captain Turner up there on the wing bridge. Okay, starboard wing bridge. There he is, where he should be. There she goes. All right, pretty cool, right? And there's her name, Lusitania. Yep. And down the East River. And away she goes. And sailing into history. All right, very good. Let's just go on. So it was an uneventful, successful crossing. May 7th, 1915, we made a successful crossing on the North Atlantic carrying 1,959 souls. It just appeared off the southern coast of Ireland. Captain Turner was commanded, received 2 warnings. These were I mentioned these general warnings from the Admiralty regarding U-boat activity, so-called, in the waters off the coast of Southern Ireland. There was much more traffic between the Admiralty and other ships and the Navy regarding U-20's progress down the west coast of Ireland, okay? Now, Turner maintains he was never told, but as I mentioned, those radio transmissions are classified, so he may have been sworn to keep quiet about it, even after the Board of Trade inquiry after the disaster. Anyway, so it was foggy. Lusitania had to slow down to like 18 knots, right, from her speed. So she was slowing down. She came in close to Old Head of Kinsale, to the southern coast of Ireland, so that Turner could take a 4-point bearing off the mainland. He needed to get a fix to see where exactly he was. He was very concerned about getting into Liverpool and crossing the Mersey Bar. He had about, I think, a short window between 4 a.m. and 9 a.m. to get over that bar. There was enough deep water to get Lusitania in over that bar. So he was very concerned about his course and started to get very tighten up on his navigation as he got off the southern coast of Ireland, okay? So typically Lusitania would have been given an escort, usually 2 destroyers out of Queenstown as she entered the war zone. This was pro forma, this was the drill for passenger liners coming into the war zone. These were eerily absent on her final crossing. Turner was expecting the Juno, you can see her right there, with these ridiculous masts, expecting the Juno to show up well to the west of Ireland and escort her in. And he told the passengers, as soon as we reach the war zone, so-called, we'll be safely in the hands of the Royal Navy. This is what he expected, but it was eerie that this was not here. The rationale was that Juno was so slow that she wouldn't be able to escort Lusitania anyway. For Lusitania to be truly not a good target, she would have to maintain a decent speed, and Juno couldn't do that. That was their story. So Admiral Coke at Queenstown was ordered to protect Lusitania as best he could. He too couldn't contact Turner, or didn't, or it's classified. We really don't know, okay? Turner was expecting an escort and he didn't get one. So on May 5th, U-20, this is an example of cruiser rules, so-called. U-20 stopped the merchant schooner Earl of Latham off Old Head of Kinsale, examined her papers, and ordered the crew to leave before sinking the schooner with grenades. They put grenades along the keelson rather, and blew a hole in her hull, and she sank quickly. The Royal Navy sent a message to all ships subs so active off the southern coast of Ireland, and later at the Fastnet Rock. Okay. May 6th, U-25, you can see, basically missed another vessel off Fastnet, sank the 6,000-ton schooner Candidate, and failed to get off a shot the 16,000-ton liner Arabic. She would sink her later, but anyway, but did sink the Centurion. So she was racking up quite a tally of victims heading south, and Lusitania was completely unaware of all of this, okay? So you can see a little bit of the course. Basically, U-20 came down the west coast of Ireland, sinking and trying to sink vessels, scooted around. Here's the, made a dramatic U-turn. Lusitania comes in, gets close to the mainland to take a bearing, as I mentioned. And actually, when Schwieger was looking at her through the periscope, he was like, well, she's way too far off to get in a shot. But then, as if by providence, Lusitania made a slight turn to starboard and closed the gap between him and made the deflection shot possible, okay? So it's kind of like so many tragedies, a coalescing of circumstances and luck, depending on who you talk to. So yeah, fire torpedo at 2:10 p.m., just 15 miles off the coast of Old Head of Kinsale. Schwieger, that's spelled wrong, ordered fire torpedo, struck the ship just aft of the first funnel with a dull thud and a minor explosion. Now, so Schwieger's like, wow, okay, 2 things. It actually hit the ship, awesome. 2, it actually exploded. Wow, it's a red letter day in U-20, because he wasn't expecting either of these things to happen. He thought that torpedo would bounce off Lusitania and she'd go on her merry way. He thought best case scenario, he might put a hole in her and she'd limp into port. But this was immediately followed by a much larger catastrophic explosion, sending debris skyward well above the boat deck. Yeah, there was about a 37-second delay or so, and this massive secondary explosion just sent debris well above the funnels, raining down, smashed boat number 5. You can see it hanging from one of the davits there. And she began an immediate list to starboard, okay? And she was still going at a good clip. So a catastrophic hull going at, 18 knots, forcing water like through a fire hose into the interior of the ship. And we'll get to what caused that second explosion in a bit. There's not a definitive answer. So, and here's a wonderful, well, it's not wonderful, but this is very telling, a very sober excerpt from Schwieger's diary. Clear bow shot at 700 meters, shot struck starboard side, close behind the bridge. An extraordinarily heavy detonation followed with a very large cloud of smoke. far above front funnel. Second explosion must have followed that of the torpedo boiler or coal or powder. It felt the coal dust ignited. And certainly this was Dr. Rob Ballard's theory. But ship stopped immediately and quickly listed sharply to starboard, sinking deeper by the head at the same time. It appeared as if it would capsize in a short time. Great confusion arose on the ship. Some of the boats were swung clear and lowered into the water. The boats, Turner had already ordered a few things. Before entering the war zone, he already ordered the canvas covers of the boats taken off. The boats were loaded with provisions, life vests, oars, swung out, importantly. The ship was darkened, so people were understanding orders to keep their curtains closed over their portholes. Any unnecessary lights were extinguished. Anyway, it was a standard protocol for entering a war zone. But anyway, so that's a very telling excerpt from Schwieger's diary. So after 2 explosions, Lusitania, a pronounced list to starboard, I think it was like 15, 20 degrees, began to sink rapidly. A few lifeboats manned, to clear the ship. This was a real problem. So she's listing so heavily to starboard that the starboard boats are, even though if they're lower to deck level, they're about there's about a 7-foot chasm between the edge of the vessel and the gunwale of the lifeboat. So people were trying to jump into these boats. They were putting planks across, trying to get over these boats. Meanwhile, on the port side, the angle was so steep, you couldn't launch the boats because they would just, basically the clinker sides of the boats would sort of slide down the side of the hull, which had, the rivets were about 1 inch proud of the hull, so they protruded 1 inch, and it was just rip up the boats to splinters. So not to mention going down by the head and having to adjust the falls to try to keep the boats level. It was a mess, okay? I think only 5 boats were launched out of, oh my goodness, 44. They had 22 fully built boats and more as many collapsible boats. The Engelhart collapsibles stowed under the main lifeboat. So the boat drill was just, the boat only lasted for 18 minutes before she went down, guys. So unlike the Titanic, which you had a very stately pace with people playing music and debating the finer points of chivalry, whether they should go down the boat, this was just a fiasco. And it really cemented this notion of barbarism. Okay, we'll get to that in a bit too. So, it's actually, counts vary between 123 or 128 Americans perished. Within 20 minutes, the great ship was gone, leaving 1,195 men, women, and children to drown in the Irish Sea. The sea was cold, but it wasn't sub-freezing. So some people did last for maybe 4 hours before they were picked up. Others didn't, okay? The Americans was the big thing for the United States. So single largest U.S. casualties incurred in a single instance before the United States entered the war. So this was big news, and this was certainly something to give a good old Woodrow Wilson pause over in America about all of this. Yeah, she's gone. So the old head of the Kinsale, you can see that to the left. It wasn't that close, but I just wanted you to see the lighthouse. The shore seemed tantalizingly close. It seemed like if you were a strong swimmer, you could just swim from where Lusitania went down to the land. In fact, Turner tried to turn hard to port to get to beach the boat when she was originally struck, but the helm didn't respond, and the engine telegraph didn't respond either. So she kept going and was still on a straight heading. So that put the kibosh on that. Anyway, this painting shows what was left, just a few boats and a lot of people floating in the sea with miscellaneous luggage and debris and sort of a greasy smoke stain where Lusitania once been. That's just what's left of the soot from the boilers. So happened so quick. People saw it from the shore as well. People from Old Head Kinsale, people on fishing boats saw this thing happen and were just amazed. They were flabbergasted. Okay. So Juno was sent. One of the things they did do when Lusitania was hit was send out a distress call. Everybody come quick. We're in trouble. We're sinking fast. The trawlers responded, but Juno was dispatched immediately, then recalled. Okay, this is a real kicker. The Admiralty, the short math is the Admiralty was short of ships, for lack of a better explanation. A lot of the fleet was deployed in the failed Gallipoli campaign, Churchill's end run, tried to go around the stalemate. Much of the fleet was in the Mediterranean, so they really they weren't up to strength in terms of their escort fleet around the homeland. So They didn't want to risk losing Juno, yet another one, if U-boats were still in the area, so they recalled her. This was really awful because if Juno they saw Juno, they saw her coming, and then saw her swing 180 degrees and head back to Queenstown. This was amazingly dispiriting to the people in the water. The fishing trawlers and other vessels didn't get there for another couple hours. So this would have been the one shot to save a great many people, and it didn't happen. Yeah, the dead were buried at Queenstown. You can see this is Lusitania. She had like 5 or 6 boats left, and there they are dockside, and these various carts with coffins on going through the streets of Queenstown and these mass graves. And this is where you can, just like Halifax with Titanic, this is where you can see most of Lusitania's dead at Queenstown. All right. So just, this is very poignant to include this last excerpt from Schwieger's diary. Many people must have lost their heads. Several boats loaded with people rushed downward, struck the water bow stern first and filled at once. The ship blew off steam. The bow of the name Lusitania in golden letters was visible. Funnels were painted black. Yeah, they did that for wartime. Stern flag not in place, was running 20 nautical miles since it seemed as if the steamer could remain above the water for a short time, went to 24 meters and ran towards the sea. Nor could I have fired a second torpedo into the swarm of people who were trying to save themselves. So obviously he felt bad, right? He was conflicted in the first place about firing on Lusitania because it's a passenger liner. He wasn't completely cold-hearted, but in his book of British vessels, war vessels, she was listed as an armed auxiliary cruiser, so as such, fair game. So he was hoping to give Lusitania, quotes, a bloody nose, and that's all. He never expected to sink her in such a horrible way. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the lenses with which we view this event, right? I've already alluded to the American lens. I've already alluded somewhat to the British lens, but the German lens, of course, back in Germany, this was viewed as a great victory, right? She was an armed auxiliary cruiser and was sunk fair and square, right? They published the warning in the paper. These guys that got on Lusitania, they were warned, okay? And this is what happened. You were warned. She's carrying munitions. She's armed. Fair game. Torpedoed in the war zone that was clearly spelled out. Yeah, and flying flags of Great Britain or any of her allies are liable to destruction. So Germans took it really one step further by issuing these commemorative medals of the sinking. A little bit bad taste. You can see they've sort of manipulated the imagery, the iconography. You can't see this. You can find this online if you want to Google it. This shows Lusitania with little gun turrets on her foredeck, bristling with cannons, clearly looking like an armed cruiser. And this down here in the lower pane is death selling tickets to unwitting passengers. You can see the skeleton, the Grim Reaper. You buy your first, second, or third class ticket to Lusitania. There were actually only a small amount of these minted or coined in Germany. What happened was in England, they got a hold of these things and then mass produced them. So that would whip up public opinion, public outcry over this travesty, this barbaric, this awful event, and just cement this notion of German barbarism. So American lens, and New York Times, you can see this classic image, sunk by submarine, probably 1,000 dead, giving you the kind of the rundown. Seen as an atrocity, sure. Shock and outrage, rest of the world. Some demanded that Wilson declare war immediately or risk losing Europeans' respect. This was leaked in by the British embassy saying that you got to come to war, you got to come in on this thing now, or nobody's going to respect you. You think you're a wimp. And Teddy Roosevelt was a strong advocate of entering the war at this juncture. Yeah, he was very outspoken against Wilson's hesitation. He was saying, come on, this is clear, we got to do this. But Wilson was a very measured man. He had studied law and international law, and he knew what going to war would do, and that's why he didn't want to do it. His response was very measured, very dispassionate, calculating, giving Germany a chance to, I'm getting ahead of myself. So yeah, he took his time in crafting his response to the tragedy, made sure it was considered to avoid undue emotionalism. And this is an emotional moment, sure. But he's not, as president, he's not going to get caught up in that. He wants to keep it cool and calm and rational. This is Wilson in a heartbeat. I mean, you have to know, Woodrow Wilson at heart was an academic. He was head of Princeton College. He was elected in 1913. He's the only U.S. president to hold an earned PhD. Not a dummy. So anyway, let's get back to this notion of the barbarism of Lusitania. So complicate matters. A few days after the Lusitania sinking, the Bryce report on Belgian atrocities comes out. It comes out May 12th. Lusitania was sunk the 7th, right? This is 5 days later. This basically attested to all of these awful atrocities that when the Germans rolled through Belgium, they raped, they pillaged, they skewered babies on bayonets. You can see this illustration on the left. Well, this coupled with the Lusitania formed a lasting stigma in the public eye of German barbarity early in the war, and this just didn't go away. It only didn't go away for Wilson. He internalized this, and it was like a slow boil with that guy. Okay, so what does Wilson do? He writes 3 notes, and this is a very careful diplomatic process that he was basically engaged between him, the British, and the Germans to try to keep America out of war. America did not want to get embroiled in what they viewed as a European affair. They were hunkered down in their sort of isolationism, saying that this is not our problem, right? You know, but it really, there's a lot to it. I mean, when you consider that France and England couldn't afford the war, and most of the war was funded by J.P. Morgan, he had loaned those governments millions of dollars to fight the war. And guess what? Morgan wanted his money back. So he leveraged the president and Congress. This is another piece to it. This is very complicated, to make good on this. Anyway, first note, he gives Germany room for disavowal, basically saying that, any nations, there must have been a mistake, right, guys? Your captain, he had too much to drink and fired this torpedo, did this crazy thing, right? It must have been a huge mistake. And I know you're going to do the right thing and say that and disavow it to the public and take responsibility for that. But Germany didn't do that. So a second note, he raises the issue of these 2 other merchant ships, the Cushing and the Gulf Light, basically saying that Germany was establishing a war zone upon the high seas. These vessels were outside of the war zone. So he said, look, what you're doing now is you're saying the whole North Atlantic is a war zone, and that's wrong too. This is all came back to this notion of freedom of the seas and international law. And we hear this again and again and again in American history, right? Freedom of the seas with War of 1812, etc. Upshot of the 3 Lusitania notes is that Germany held strict accountability for future acts of lawlessness against the neutral America. So anyway, that was the bottom line. German response to the first note, as we've said, carrying contraband, fair target. They did offer this little interesting deal. If the United States were to exert pressure on Britain to end their hunger blockade, then a settlement could be reached with regards to protection of America. So we're going to cover your back, your American shipping, if you get Britain to end this hunger blockade, okay? Because Germany needs materiel to wage the war. The U.S. didn't go for that, of course, because Britain is a staunch ally, all right? So there's this split with Wilson. German politicians want to keep U.S. happy, believe America can end the war, and encourage other neutrals to do the same. But the politicians never thought that America would, on no account, go to war. Admiralty, however, this is the German admiralty, thought that Wilson was all talk. He was a paper president, right? These notes, they're silly. It's like if he was a real man, he would have gone to war by now, right? He sends these silly notes over here. It's like, we don't respect him. But this isn't what happened, okay? So let's talk a little bit about the British lands, just to make it that much more complicated and interesting. So Churchill writing after the war, retrospectively, wonderful choice quote. In spite of all its horror, we must regard the sinking of Lusitania as most important and favorable to the Allies. The poor babies who perished in the ocean struck a blow at German power that could never have been achieved by 100,000 fighting men. So he's talking about public opinion, right? He's talking about that image, that idea. And I think there were 37 infants on board, and I think most of them perished. It was awful, okay? Not nearly the type of that many saved like on the Titanic. It was just an awful body count, okay? So this is what he's saying, that this was huge in terms of winning popular support for the war in America and England. So the Admiralty couldn't let it leak that they were not at full strength, right? They couldn't say that most of our fleet's in the Mediterranean and we can't protect the British Isles, because then it's like it's ringing the dinner bell for U-boats to sink everything in sight. So they needed to come up with a better reason, a better excuse for why Lusitania sank. They needed a scapegoat. So the Admiralty wanted Lord Mersey, who presided over the Board of Trade Inquiry, who also presided over the Titanic. He was the perfect man for the job, having overseen yet another great maritime disaster and its Board of Inquiry. They wanted Mersey to finger Turner and say he screwed up. And he wasn't zigzagging. He was going too slow. He came close to the headlands, which he was supposed to stay mid-channel. All these things. Well, Mersey's like, well, I'm not doing that. He said, he seems like a competent captain to me, and I'm not going to ruin his life and his career just so you guys can do this. So basically, he had to come up with another way. Couldn't do the Admiralty because it's times of war, and in times of war, often government has to play ball to win the war. So the Admiralty couldn't be blamed. So he's going to put it all on the Germans. The Germans fired, he said, 3 or 4 torpedoes. It was an awful, murderous crime, heinous crime, and we're going to dump it all in Germany's lap, okay? In spite of the fact that she was an armed cruiser and all of that stuff. So this became a huge propaganda piece, Lusitania. Look at this wonderful, there's a mother and her baby drowning and enlist. Just says it all. Irishmen avenge Lusitania. Join the Irish regiment today. Take up the sword of justice. There's Lusitania sinking in the background. So this became bill of fare for every recruiter in England and America, right? Remember Lusitania? Come on. It's like, it's awful. It's terrible. So I promised you a nod to the Maryland lens to this event as well. And I'm like, what does this have to do with Maryland history? Well, I did cull through the archives of the Sun, the Baltimore Sun, and basically the Sun sort of appropriated much of what the rest of the country was saying. I mean, what's true for the part is true for the whole. Maryland were just as outraged as anybody else in the country about what happened. Yet, and we've seen this before, in other pieces of Maryland history, their overarching stance was one of reconciliation, right? Or you can see here, Maryland being just, you got to love Maryland for this, being ever so moderate and ever so like easygoing, for lack of a better term, wanted not to go to war, wanted to figure out another way than going to war and avoiding all that carnage. So they're basically, Maryland Division of the Organization of American Women for Strict Neutrality. Sent a telegram to President Wilson yesterday urging him to get all the facts in on the Lusitania case before sending a second note to Germany. So they're wanting him to slow down even more and really think about what it is he's doing, okay? So that was kind of the one sort of Maryland-esque thing. And again, here's another one. Sun stance May 9th. This is 2 days after the sinking, was to support Wilson in a considered response to the tragedy, not to rock the boat and rush to war. So again, they're standing behind their president, which is good because many didn't, and feeling that he should take his time to really think about this and all aspects of this before committing America to war, okay? So that was pretty much the above and beyond Maryland view on this tragedy in terms of what was different about it. Okay. Interestingly, too, Bethlehem Steel in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, in 1916, opened a shipbuilding facility, I think Point of Pines, north of Chesapeake Bay, to meet the war need of building more ships in Maryland. So that's another interesting little tidbit that came out of Lusitania sinking. Okay, so enduring intrigue. If Titanic had an enduring fascination, there's certainly enduring intrigue with Lusitania. It's one of these enigmatic puzzles that just doesn't have an easy answer at all, okay? So a few things happened after the sinking. The Board of Trade, as I mentioned, cleared Captain Turner, went about its business. As you know, the U.S. entered the war in 1917 because Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. They had stopped or sort of mitigated it to a certain extent to Wilson's liking. Finally, they resumed it in 1917, spring of 1917, General Falkenhayn saw it as a elemental struggle for existence. They had to sink British shipping to end this hunger blockade, which is what they called the blockade of the North. Anyway, just to give you a kind of recap on entering the war. So in the 1950s, everybody knew where the wreck was, right? Fishermen had been getting their nets hung up on this thing. It was only in like 360 feet of water. It was, compared to the Titanic, which was 13,000 feet above sea level, this was only 365 feet above sea level. You could practically see it. So fishermen were getting their nets hung up on this thing since she sunk. There was a buoy marking the wreck as well. So everyone knew where it was. 1950s, the Royal Navy tried to destroy the wreck by using depth charges. So what are they doing blowing up this wreck that's already sunk? Well, maybe there's something to hide. Not being paranoid, I'm just trying to think. Maybe it was target practice, if I'm being generous. 1980 salvage operation on the wreck Lusitania was torpedo and Fisher war triggered a startling Foreign Office warning that its sinking could still literally blow up on us. So it's basically, the salvage operation was published on the Lusitania, and the Foreign Office had to issue a warning saying that there were things that could still go boom in that boat. Newly released secret Whitehall files disclosed Ministry of Defense warning that something startling was going to be found during the August 1982 salvage operation. There's such serious concerns. Previously undeclared war munitions explosives might be found that divers involved were officially warned in strongest terms of the possible danger to life and limb they faced. So guess what, folks? In spite of all those denials that she was carrying munitions, they're there. They're there. So Bob Ballard, as we know from Titanic fame, he really got a taste for finding famous shipwrecks. He found the Titanic and then went on to find the Bismarck in 1989. What's important about this, sensationalist headlines aside, is every time one of these wrecks is thoroughly explored, especially by a scientist, Dr. Ballard is a scientist at his core, we learn something new about the wreck, and it does help to clarify questions that we may have. He found the Lusitania in 1993. Again, it wasn't hard to find. It was actually, you can see this illustration, these nets hung up on various pieces of the superstructure. And as I mentioned, just enhances what we know about the wreck. So why did Lusitania sink? Okay, lots of different explanations. Initially it was thought that the torpedo ignited the munitions she was carrying, which produced a tremendous secondary explosion. That may have been true. We just don't know. Ballard seemed to think that it was, Lusitania's coal bunkers were nearly empty when she was off the coast of Ireland. So there's a tremendous amount of coal dust in the coal bunkers. So when the torpedo hit, the thinking was this stirred up as sort of all of this particulate coal dust inside the bunkers, and just one spark ignited it. Now, I've also seen examinations and discussions where some felt that wasn't sufficient explosion to blow out the bottom of the Lusitania. She had a double bottom, and sink her as quickly as she did. So that was Ballard's view. He found a lot of coal on the ocean floor, so he thought that it was a coal-related explosion. Now, I found an interesting article in Scientific American which claimed that aluminum and bronze powders did the job. Cargo manifest lists 50 barrels of aluminum and 50 barrels of bronze powder, and you can read on here basically if enough powder was sort of airborne and ignited by a torpedo explosion, it would be a tremendous detonation. Add to that seawater, which basically would give off hydrogen gas. And if you remember from the Hindenburg disaster, what that did, very explosive, very flammable. So their conclusion in Scientific American one seems likely that a few barrels of ordinary cargo and common chemistry helped one torpedo sink this grand ocean liner. So that's another theory, okay? We really don't know what happened, what really caused that massive and fatal second explosion. Of course, during the war, that was used munitions by the Germans, and of course, the Admiralty had to deny that. Cunard had to deny that as well. So, conclusions. Yeah, it has many, many layers imbued with a visceral and intellectual dissonance. It's true. It was an awful thing. It was an atrocity. By some, it was a great victory, according to others. We don't know what actually happened. There's much to the story that remains untold. The truth is subject to which lens you subscribe to, right? You can kind of see each person's point of view on this. And as I mentioned, aspects of the sinking remain classified to this day. And in just to recap, in 1915, the sinking helped cement the notion of German barbarism, so-called, in the public eye, and by extension was the largest single factor contributed to the U.S. entry into World War I. Yeah, Wilson said, you know, you guys are resuming this unrestricted warfare. We're not doing this anymore. And the thing that really popped into his head the most was Lusitania. You know, when he was debating whether to issue a war declaration after he'd gotten or I think it was before he asked for Congress for a war declaration. Apparently, according to his aides, he walked around in a fog for several days. He just couldn't bring himself to do it. He knew what this war would bring, and he was right actually. So but how it's been described, his moral compass wouldn't allow him to not act, right? The son of a Presbyterian minister, he had a very strong sense of morality. He was a crusader, as we know from his League of Nations, right? Democratize all of Europe. Well, guess what? Some countries are better with benevolent dictators than democracies, unfortunately. Anyway, Wilson was a captor of his own morality and his own convictions. And as I mentioned, when Germany resumed unrestricted warfare, he could not sit by and do nothing, right? He couldn't do that. So anyway, all right. I think we're at time, 5 minutes over, which is good. I thought this was going to go on a lot longer than it did, which is good. Does anybody have any questions or comments that they'd like to make? Come on. I know there's one or two of you out there that have a question or a comment. Come on, folks. Don't be shy.
If you want to do a question, you got to unmute yourself.
Well, that's true.
What do you think? The Zimmerman telegram helped him decide to go against Germany too.
That's absolutely true.
That was as big as the Lusitania, if not bigger.
Yeah, that's true. That's absolutely true. I didn't mention that, but that's right. Yep. Other comments? What do you guys think? Was she an armed cruiser or passenger liner, or both, or what do you think? You think Germany was right to do what she did? I mean, if you were a nation and your people were starving and you needed supplies to wage war, I mean, would you do the same thing? It's an interesting question.
Well, reading about Winston Churchill, I think there's no doubt about it. Absolutely no question about it that he was a conniving SOB.
Well, he was. Yeah, he definitely was. Wow.
So was Roosevelt.
Yeah, I mean, so these leaders. I mean, one thing you'd said from them, they did not shy away from making tough decisions. Okay. Yeah, FDR and good old Winnie. Yeah. So, anybody else? Well, there's some books that you should read if you're interested. Colin Simpson's book on the Lusitania is very good. And so is this one by Bob Ballard, Exploring Lusitania. It has wonderful underwater paintings and images of Lusitania. She's pretty much half of her beam. Right now, she's about 40 feet wide instead of 80 feet wide. So she's crumpled in on herself. Most of her superstructure's gone. But there are some interesting things that are still there that Ballard found, which is great. Colin Simpson and Eric Larson's Dead Wake Eric Larson offers a fresh, I won't say fresh perspective, but new information on the sinking, which is worth read. I mean, it's a good read if you're interested in this type of disaster. And the Colin Simpson book, I have it back here. This is kind of like the go-to book. It was written in 1972. And this is a very good book, which has a lot of good information and brings all these lenses to the fore. What's this? Thank you. We have to go. Okay. Enough Lusitania for you. All right. Whoops. All right. Anybody else? No?
If I could just add, with regards to the attempt to depth charge the Lusitania, I think it was in the 1980s. Was that
1950s?
1950s. Was that an attempt basically to blow up any possible active munitions that might still be on that ship?
Well, that's certainly a good question. The Admiralty isn't going to tell us why they did it. They probably call it a training exercise. But the real story, as we're finding, is not so apparent. They're not going to say, well, yeah, there's munitions down there, so we're just going to destroy the evidence. Yeah, so they just prefer all of that to just go away, right? So.
And my second question is there or was there any plans to raise the Lusitania after it was found by Ballard?
No, because the hull was so far gone. I mean, it's literally it's like a crushed beer can on the ocean floor. The bow is still intact. You can see the anchor. You can see the outline of the name. Part of the, there's some incidental structures and equipment that is invisible. I think 4 of the screws, 3 out of the 4 screws were raised. Those big bronze propellers were raised, and they're on display. I think in Liverpool, or at least one of them is. Maybe Queenstown as well. So those were raised, but the hull itself is so far gone. And that actually is an interesting point, because perhaps the reason they depth charged it was so it couldn't be raised. I mean, Ballard noticed that there were these many holes in the hull that were like, well, he likens it to like a pop-top soda can. Like they push through in a circular, as crescent shaped, push through like a depth charge blowing in on that hull. So perhaps there was so much degradation of the hull and the site itself by the Royal Navy in the 50s that it couldn't be raised. So there were I forget the guy's name, but there's a picture of him diving on the wreck in a great big diver's outfit or costume, or not costume, diving suit. So anyway, but yeah, I don't think any attempt was made to raise it seriously. Certainly not the kooky attempts like on the Titanic with the ping pong balls and the Vaseline. Although that probably would have worked better on Lusitania if she wasn't full of holes.
Thank you very much. Really interesting presentation. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad. Glad.
Mark, I also enjoyed it. I'll talk to you shortly, all right?
Oh, yeah, yes, you will.
All right, catch you later.
Lusitania.
Yeah,
Bye.
thank you again. Thank
You
you
bet.
again.
My pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your evening, folks.
Wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and don't forget to join us. The Maryland in the Age of Sail resumes a week from Thursday at 5 p.m.
Civil War. You're going to like that one.
Civil
Well,
War,
we'll be
big
there.
one. That's a fun one. All right. All right. Take care. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye. Thanks, Mark.